Ball State Library of Explication Tapes. The following discussion of literature is one of a series made possible through a Lilly Endowment grant. The award was made by the Committee on Foundation Grants of the Association of College and Research Libraries, a division of the American Library Association. These grants are for the purpose of promoting more extensive and imaginative use of library resources by undergraduate students. Unless otherwise specified, the panelists are members of the English Department of Ball State Teachers College. 3 poems by Thomas Hardy. Discussing these poems are Professor Jean Andrews, Professor Alfred Marks, and Professor David W. Shepard.
Hap by Thomas Hardy. If but some vengeful God would call to me from up the sky and laugh, thou suffering thing, know that thy sorrow is my ecstasy, that thy love's loss is my hate's profiting. Then would I bear it, clench myself and die, steeled by the sense of ire unmerited, half eased in that a powerfuller than I had willed and meted me the tears I shed. But not so. How arrives it joy lies slain, and why unblooms the best hope ever sown? Crass casualty obstructs the sun and rain, and dicing time for gladness casts a moan. These purblind doomsters had as readily strewn blisses about my pilgrimage as pain.
Well, Dr. Andrews and Dr. Marks, it seems to me that with the first stanza of this poem, we have an immediate statement of frustration. A man thinks that life is a rather wretched state of affairs. He does not like it. But he says, now, if God would appear to me and say, well, I am responsible for your suffering, then the poet says, well, this might make the suffering bearable. But God has not said that. And I think another thing here is that Hardy is pretty much implying that this is the way God is, even though God may not step before him and say, thou suffering thing, I enjoy your misery.
Well, I don't know that I can agree with your conclusion about Hardy's opinion of the nature of God. Hardy does say pretty clearly that he wishes that God were cruel, inhuman, and taunting, that if he were confronted with such a God, he would get some sense of satisfaction out of heroically resigning himself to his fate. That is, if he felt that he were being oppressed by a God which was hopelessly more powerful than he himself, he would get a sense of satisfaction out of the feeling that his fate was unavoidable and that he might as well resign himself to it. But don't you think, Dr. Marks, that in the third stanza, his conclusion is somewhat different?
Yes, his conclusion is that he doesn't like the fact that there does not seem to be anybody in charge of this universe. And as he says in the first stanza, he would be quite delighted, or he would be eased anyway in his difficult plight, if there seemed to be a God running the world, and even a vengeful God. Now he says, if but some vengeful God would call to me from up the sky and laugh, if God assumed the guise of a person who was somehow taking out his ire on man, and would say to him in a laugh, while he is suffering here in his pain, God laughs at him. And this vengeful God, if he would say to him, thou suffering thing, know that thy sorrow is my ecstasy. Know that I know joy in your sorrow. and that my hate profits in the loss of things which you love by you. Then he says, if this would happen, I'd be able to bear it. And I would be able to die somehow feeling that I had been abused. And this is the difficulty in the third stanza, is that he would like to have a sense of being abused, but he can't even have this. He has only the sense that something which did not have anything against him did something against him.
Isn't there the possibility that Hardy may be trapped by his own metaphors here? He denies that, or at least he says as far as he can see, this is not the case. But his metaphors carry him over to crass casualty, dicing time, doomsters. These are all capitalized. He seems to create a pantheon of his own here. So at least Hardy does have someone to blame.
Yes, he has some force to blame, all right, but it certainly isn't a God in the usual sense of the term. I suppose the two most common versions of God are the picture of the benevolent God that we have on the one hand, the God presented to us in the New Testament, and the picture of the very malevolent God that we sometimes find in primitive religions, the God who takes a positive pleasure in inflicting pain upon mankind. I think here, though, that Hardy dismisses without considering the possibility of a benevolent God and states that he would actually be happier if there were a God of some sort, even if he were cruel. But what gives Hardy the greatest pain is the fact that there is no reasonable force in the universe at all, that blind luck determines man's fate. Pure chance.
Perhaps we shouldn't digress on theology. It seems to me Hardy has ruled out any possibility of a benevolent God. If he admits that as an alternative, then his description of the world as he sees it catches him in a dilemma. If God is all-powerful and all good, he shouldn't let this happen, and if he's all good and lets it happen, he's not all-powerful. It's that old dilemma.
Oh, no, I think I would agree with you that that's what I meant when I said that he dismisses without even considering the possibility of a benevolent God. He considers this such a possibility self-evidently false.
And in the last stanza, it is interesting to notice that he capitalizes these forces in the world that are the nearest thing the world knows to divinity. So he capitalizes here crass casualty, as if that were a deity, and then capitalizes time. This is another one of the things that takes the place of a deity in this world. And then he capitalizes doomsters. In crass casualty, of course, we see him using casualty in a way that we are not entirely familiar with. It is perhaps the word casualty as it's used by insurance companies, or as we know the term casual as it means something that happens once in a while. I think I learned the term first when I was a child, and the word casual purchases was used by the NRA. People who made casual purchases did not have to follow the particular buying restrictions that were levied on buying at that time. Something crass casualty is simply bare happenstance, as it were, which obstructs the sun and rain. It doesn't matter. Now it obstructs the sun, and now it obstructs the rain. And depending on what just might happen, we either have a good day or a bad day.
Yes, I think it's it's rather interesting that although Hardy states here pretty clearly that man's fate is determined entirely by chance, we find also the clear implication that somehow or another this fate turns out to be unpleasant, though, even if it is determined entirely by chance. And I think we'll see in our examination of some of the other poems of Hardy that we cannot accept this poem, Hap, as a declaration of faith, but is intended merely as one of a number of possibilities that Hardy suggests to explain the reasons for the governing of the universe.
A Plaint to Man. When you slowly emerged from the den of time, and gained percipience as you grew, and fleshed you fair out of shapeless slime, wherefore, O man, did there come to you the unhappy need of creating me, a form like your own, for praying to? My virtue, power, utility, within my Maker must all abide, since none in myself can ever be. One thin as a phasm on a lantern slide, shone forth in the dark upon some dim sheet, and by none but its showman vivified. Such a forced device, you may say, is meet for easing a loaded heart at. Man needs to conceive of a mercy seat somewhere above the gloomy aisles of this wailful world, or he could not bear the irk no local hope beguiles. But since I was formed in your first despair, the doing without me has had no play in the minds of men when shadows scare. And now that I dwindle day by day beneath the deicide eyes of seers in a light that will not let me stay, and tomorrow the whole of me disappears, the truth should be told, and the fact be faced that had best been faced in earlier years. The fact of life with dependence placed on the human heart's resource alone, in brotherhood bonded close, and graced with loving kindness fully blown, and visioned help unsought, unknown. Dr. Marks, I think probably the first problem that arises in this poem is that of the speaker. Who seems to be speaking in this poem, A Plaint to Man?
It seems to be God speaking, and it makes this poem set up an interesting contrast to New Year's Eve. In New Year's Eve, we had man saying to God, "Why shaped you us, who in this tabernacle groan?" Here it seems to be God who is talking to man and asking of man, "Wherefore, O man, did there come to you the unhappy need of creating me?"
Yes, I think in this first stanza also we have an interesting reference to the doctrine of evolution, which of course had a tremendous effect upon 19th century thought. Notice that man does not appear to have been created. Man slowly emerged from the den of time and fleshed fair out of shapeless slime. That is, here we have the very strong implication that mankind evolved from some lower form. I think probably here it's even stronger than a lower form of life. Mankind appears to have evolved out of some sort of inanimate earth, perhaps. And only slowly did man gain percipience, knowledge, the the power to think. So that here we have this idea of evolution coming out in Hardy's poem, and of course this is an idea which is alluded to frequently in his poetry.
One thing that baffles me, one would think that in an age in which God is destroyed, so to speak, that the poets and the men would sit around and glorify themselves. Hardy certainly does not glorify man in any of these poems, and I can't see that he is glorifying man here. It seems to me he's caught in an impasse of some kind. He wants to admit the facts as they are, and yet he can't quite admit them.
I think 19th century thinkers reacted in at least two different ways. One school interpreted this theory of evolution as establishing mankind's brotherhood with the animals, and consequently one school of thought interpreted the theory of evolution as something that degraded mankind. Of course, other thinkers, perhaps the more scientific and the less theological thinkers, seem to be able to accept this idea as a part of a master plan even, and were able to reconcile the theory of evolution with some form of theology, although usually not with Christian theology.
Of course, I think we may get an illustration here of what happens when we have the vulgarization of a theory. That Darwin's theories are decidedly more complicated than the popularized versions of them make them out to be. And when we get an easy one-shot version of Darwin, we may come up with something that will be in immediate conflict with theology. And the person who propounds it thinks that he has something that will work in theology. And he hasn't. He has something that will work in science, perhaps. I'm wondering about this unhappy need of creating me. Perhaps we have an ironic comment here directed at the person who says, aha, there is no God, therefore, so on and so forth.
It is ironic, and it makes an interesting ironic contrast again to New Year's Eve. There it was man who was so unhappy about being created by God. Here it is God who is so unhappy about being created by man, and the lines, "a form like your own," make it appear that in this poem the words of the book of Genesis, in which man is created in the image of God, are being reversed, and here God is being created in the image of man.
Yes, of course, this is a dramatic artifice that the poet is employing here. He is deliberately putting words into the mouth of a creature that exists only in the mind of man, according to Hardy's view of things.
Suppose that I read this poem aloud. Suppose that I read the words of God here in a very supercilious and rather nasty fashion. I come up with a completely different interpretation of the poem. Now do you follow my point on that?
One does with any poem, depending on how he reads
And
it aloud.
my question is this interpretation justified?
Well, I think that when we consider the poem as a whole, it is clear that the God who is speaking is a creature which does not exist in fact, but which exists only in the mind of man, because he later points out, for instance, that he's being destroyed.
I think it is also interesting that in this third stanza, in the words, "My virtue, power, utility within my Maker must all abide, since none in myself can ever be," that God, in actually placing virtue, power, and utility in the mind of man, because if they hadn't been in the mind of man in the first place, man would not have tried to place them in his God, that this God then is, in a way, rescuing something very important from the wreck of man's faith thanks to evolution, and is giving some very important qualities to man that rescue a good deal from the Victorian dilemma.
Yes, of course, this is in a sense a rebuff directed to man also. Those who plead that God is not answering their prayers might profit from reading this, of course. This God, this figment of the imagination, answers that I have only the utility that rests in you. I have no utility in myself. All of the virtue and utility that I have was taken from you.
Well, I think that's something that I had in mind when I mentioned the variation on the reading of it, giving it a rather nasty quality, that it might be interpreted in that sense as a rebuff to a man who has created God but has not done something else.
I think, however, that in that third stanza we see the beginning of his trying to give something back to man, and this we'll see in the last stanza. The fourth stanza is quite interesting. The reference of God to himself as being something thin as a phasm on a lantern slide, shone forth in the dark upon some dim sheet, and by none but its showman vivified. And this brings up the term phantasmagoria, which is very frequently used by romantic writers, but is not too often known. And it refers to a process of projection that was used in the late 18th century by a magician of Paris whose name was Robertson, and who saw to it that he was not guillotined as a magician by saying that he was doing this as simply an essay and an experiment in science. And the phantasmagoria technique was to place people in a theater and then to suspend above their heads invisible sheets. They came in the darkness, so they didn't see the sheets above their heads. And then, using a magic lantern, or what nowadays we might call an opaque projector, in the back of the room, he placed pictures in the projector and shone them in the darkness on those transparent sheets above the heads of the watchers. And they became terribly frightened when they saw these images suddenly appear on the sheet above them. This went on well in Napoleon's time until Robertson made the mistake of showing the picture of Louis XVI. This got him into trouble immediately, and the place closed not long afterward. But this picture then, on a lantern slide, shone forth in the dark upon some dim sheet, and by none but its showman vivified, means that we take some inanimate object, something which is not alive, and we make this into a phantasmagoric image of God.
Well, am I incorrect in assuming then that we might insert here that there is a quality of charlatanism about the man who builds God in his own image, a quality of magic? In other words, this is not the real thing at all.
Yes, I think that implication can be there. We are told in the autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini about a magic trick of showing figures on smoke. And it's very possible that medieval charlatans used a technique of that kind. Again, the phantasmagoria technique, projecting a picture on smoke, which is a kind of screen.
Of course, I think the next stanza indicates that perhaps that Hardy doesn't regard this as a deliberate device of self-deception, but perhaps instead a subconscious device. He has mankind answer by saying that this device of creating God is appropriate for easing a loaded heart. That is, man needs to seek comfort somewhere, because he continues, man needs to conceive of a mercy seat somewhere above the gloomy aisles of this wailful world, or he could not bear the irk no local hope beguiles. That is, I think, what Hardy is saying here is that mankind would be unable to face the suffering and the tribulations of this world without God, or at least he thinks he would be unable to face them without God, because there appears to be no hope or no comfort in this world itself.
I'm not sure that Hardy is voicing that. I simply think that he is repeating an argument he has heard. In other words, you get into a theological dispute with someone, arguing over the existence or non-existence of God. One of the usual rebuttals is, well, would life be worthwhile if there were no God? Sort of an argument in a circle.
Well, yes, I think you're right. Clearly enough, he's putting this argument into the mouth of man who is answering the reproach of God. Yes.
I think this is going to become important again when we get to the end of the poem.
Yes, and clearly enough, as you say, Dr. Shepard, he does say, you may say this, but we begin the seventh stanza. But since I was formed in your first despair, the doing without me has had no play. And so we get a qualification on the argument that is stated in quotation marks here.
Yes, what he's saying in effect is that mankind has never tried to get along without me before. Every time he is frightened, every time shadows scare him, he turns to God. He has never tried a social system without a God.
The stanza, the doing without me has had no play in the minds of men when shadows scare. As a diversion for a moment, you feel that Hardy's style becomes a little bit labored here?
Hardy's style in poetry is almost always labored. This is perhaps a subjective opinion, and perhaps not entirely complimentary to Hardy, but I find a definite labored quality throughout Hardy's poetry.
I think I would agree with you that this line is not the most felicitous arrangement of words possible. That it does contain some awkward negatives, although I can't say that I would agree completely with Dr. Marks' judgment of Hardy's poetry as a whole. I think in this next stanza, we have an interesting insight into the effect of the new science upon 19th century thought. And now that I dwindle day by day beneath the deicide eyes of seers in a light that will not let me stay, and so on into the next stanza, here we have an idea presented which certainly disturbed a great many theologians and other thinkers of the 19th century. That is, the discoveries of science, many thinkers believed, were making God unnecessary. Huxley, for instance, points out that throughout the history of mankind, he has attempted to explain the unknown by reference to God. Whenever any natural phenomenon occurred that could not be explained, it was interpreted as a miracle. Whenever a plague struck, it was interpreted by scientists, by medical men, and by theologians certainly, as being a punishment for the sins of mankind. And with the increasing knowledge brought by 19th century science, many of these events which previously had been unexplained were found to have perfectly rational explanations. That is, instead of running to the churches in time of plague, people began to examine the sewage system. So that God, I think, Hardy implies here, is being destroyed, is being murdered through the eyes of seers who were bringing greater knowledge to mankind and making God unnecessary.
One thing we might add here, I think we ought not to create the impression that this type of thing was popular. In other words, science had freed the scientist, or perhaps more appropriately, the philosopher. He no longer had to worry about the police power of the state, at least in England and many other European countries. But he was free to engage in a great deal of speculation that he probably would have avoided in the 18th century, or simply would have been impossible for him in the 18th century. I doubt if this deicide descended to the popular level. Commenting on what the scientists did in the 19th century, I'd like to cite one Italian sociologist writing in 1912, pointing out that some of the scientists of the time, pseudoscientists, had jumped at the fact that geology proves that the earth was made in a given period of time, therefore we have debunked Genesis. And Prater's point is that we get our information on geology from the geologists, we get our information on theology from the Old Testament. We happen to be a Christian. That the two have no bearing on one another. What happened, many of the vulgarization of science. Science is appropriate over here, therefore it's appropriate to everything else. I suppose that some of the philosophers were in something of a dither, as they still are. But the point I want to make is that perhaps this is not a view of how the man on the street was thinking. This is a poet commenting on some scientists. Well, what about this word deicide in this stanza? We have homicide, parricide, fratricide, matricide. Now all of a sudden we have deicide, and it seems to be an interesting play on the word deified.
Yes, of course, yes. Deicide is the killing of God. Deified is the making of God. Mm-hmm. Yes, I think you're right. I think probably you're correct in saying that this conception of the effect of science upon religion didn't reach down to the common man directly. However, I think it is true that it influenced the great thinkers of the time, who in turn influenced their disciples, who in turn influenced the common man. That is, the men who, the great thinkers of the time, were certainly profoundly affected by the discoveries of new science. And in many instances, of course, the new principles of science which had been discovered were directly applied to a study of Genesis. And some of the parables of Jesus, for instance, were examined in the light of 19th century scientific discoveries. The parable of how Jesus drove the evil spirits out of the man and into the herd of swine, for instance, was examined in the light of scientific knowledge, and most scientists reached the conclusion that this was a story which simply could not be supported. That is, Christ seemed to be expressing a belief in witchcraft, evil spirits.
Prater's point is that the scientist can draw no conclusion at all, because he can't go back and verify it. He can take some of the modern myths and verify them, and arrive at a true or false.
It is interesting to see what happened a few years ago when Immanuel Velikovsky published When Worlds Collide, with his theories that the incident in Joshua in which the sun stands still in the heavens and the rivers run with milk and honey is actually an incident in history in which the planet Venus collided with the Earth, and that thanks to the colliding, the Earth stood still on its axis for a time, and at this time the sun stood still in the heavens, and that the rivers of milk and honey were caused by the carbohydrates formed by the collision of the gases of the earth with the atmosphere of Venus. However, at that time, the scientists raised a fairly decent hullabaloo, and actually many scientists refused to publish for the particular publisher that was publishing Velikovsky's book, because this was a rather impossible feat that he was attempting, and that he was trying to show on not very good scientific grounds a scientific basis for some scriptural events of definitely marvelous character. Now the poem continues with, after the line, "And tomorrow the whole of me disappears," the truth should be told and the fact be faced that had best been faced in earlier years. My thought is that he has already prepared us for this truth. He's mentioned it once before. We should recognize the truth that the virtues that we place in God are actually virtues that we had in us before, and that we simply make of God something that we would like to make him. But he does give us an ethical point after the colon then, and in the last two stanzas. The fact of life, with dependence placed on the human heart's resource alone, in brotherhood bonded close and graced with loving kindness fully blown, and visioned help unsought, unknown. So he's saying then that the human heart should place dependence upon itself alone, upon its own resources, and that it should look to brotherhood with other men, and should value loving kindness, and that it should not seek help in visions.
There seems to be a criticism here of man that he has invented God. That invention was unnecessary, and moreover it was an escape mechanism by which man avoided doing what he should have done. In other words, the matter of brotherhood poses far more difficult problems than the creation of a deity.
Yes, I think also that if we read this poem carefully, we discover that God does not say at the time of the writing of this poem that he has been completely destroyed. He's only dwindling day by day, and that tomorrow the whole will disappear. The implication here, I think, is that with greater knowledge, with more scientific discoveries, less and less emphasis will be placed upon God, less and less belief will be given to the existence of a God. And as you suggest, though, I think his conclusion is that instead of looking to the God that we have created for help, we should depend upon ourselves and look to those qualities which lie within man himself in order to make life more pleasant on this earth.
Well, it doesn't follow that as God dwindles, that man is automatically going to take up brotherhood. Well, that may be the point he's making here.
Well, I think it's the point that the very fact that man has taken the trouble to create God, and to create this God who exemplifies so many characteristics that don't seem to be true around man, is to Hardy something encouraging. And it is on this small bit of encouragement that God should have created, or that man should have created a God with power, virtue, and utility, that give Hardy the ability to build this ethic that he gives us in the last 5 lines.
This is an ethic which mankind should adopt, not one that mankind necessarily will adopt.
3 poems by Thomas Hardy. Discussing these poems are Professor Gene Andrews, Professor Alfred Marks, and Professor David W. Shepard.
Thomas Hardy's The Convergence of the Twain, Lines on the Loss of the Titanic. In a solitude of the sea, deep from human vanity and the pride of life that planned her, stilly couches she. Steel chambers, late the pyres of her salamandrine fires, cold currents thread and turn to rhythmic tidal lyres. Over the mirrors meant to glass the opulent, the sea worm crawls, grotesque, slimed, dumb, indifferent. Jewels in joy designed to ravish the sensuous mind lie lightless, all their sparkles bleared and black and blind. Dim, moon-eyed fishes near gaze at the gilded gear and query, what does this vaingloriousness down here? Well, while was fashioning this creature of cleaving wing, the eminent will that stirs and urges everything prepared a sinister mate for her, so gaily great, a shape of ice, for the time far and dissociate. And as the smart ship grew in stature, grace, and hue, in shadowy, silent distance grew the iceberg too. Alien they seemed to be. No mortal eye could see the intimate welding of their later history, or sign that they were bent by paths coincident on being anon twin halves of one august event, till the spinner of the years said, now, and each one hears, and consummation comes and jars two hemispheres. I notice that the subtitle of this poem is Lines on the Loss of the Titanic. Dr. Shepard, perhaps you could refresh our memory by telling us what the Titanic was and under what circumstances it was lost.
I would guess that most of us are familiar with the Titanic, at least with the name. We know in general that it was an ocean liner, that it rammed an iceberg, that it sank. This occurred in 1912. On the 14th of April, I believe, sometime between 11:30 and midnight. The Titanic was the biggest, the most luxurious liner of its time. It was allegedly insinkable. It represented a certain amount of pride that Hardy talks about here. The builders were so certain that the Titanic was unsinkable that they did not even have enough lifeboats on board. There were no lifeboat drills to amount to anything. The result was that when the ship was rammed this iceberg, tremendous loss in life. The ship was simply not prepared for the disaster.
Yes, of course, it's one of the great disasters of maritime history. And I think in this opening stanza of the poem, Hardy introduces the theme of his poem as a whole. That is, we have the theme of human vanity and the pride of life that planned her introduced.
And of course, the liner, she refers to the liner. The poem begins with the ship sunk, simply far from all human traffic of any kind.
Yes,
pride of life brings up one point, Dr. Andrews. There is some superstition connected with the word Titanic, and it refers to the Titans, and apparently there is some history of disaster occurring to anything that has the name Titanic. And question is, who were the gods who gave fire to man?
Well, of course,
Were they the Titans?
Yes. Prometheus,
Mhm.
of course, was a Titan, and Epimetheus, and Cronus, and Re, the father of that generation of Greek gods that are most commonly known. It interested me that you described the Titanic as being far from all kind of vanity. You'll notice that Hardy twists this little idiom a bit. Instead of describing the ship as being far from human vanity, for obvious reasons, he says that it is deep from human vanity.
It is also important to notice that in the third line he capitalizes pride and capitalizes life into pride of life. And we might wonder there, we won't say exactly why at this time it is capitalized, but we might wonder there if this is going to be one of his basic terms underlying his thought on the sinking of the Titanic and perhaps on the nature of the world.
Yes, I think also we have another note sounded in the third line of this first stanza, the word couches to describe the Titanic. I think as we examine the poem, we'll discover that the basic image that Hardy is employing here is that of a marriage ceremony, so that the bottom of the sea becomes a sort of nuptial couch.
What do we make of the second stanza? Steel chambers late the pyres of her salamandrine fires. What is a salamandrine fire?
Well, this relates to the quality of the salamander, the supposed ability of the salamander to live in fire. And we have then the fires that once burned in the furnaces of the Titanic compared with some magic fire created by a sorcerer in which the salamander might live.
Yes, I think then the ship is really being compared to the salamander, just as the salamander lives on fire. The life of the ship, that is its propulsion system, depends upon the fires in its stokers.
And then in the third line we have the fact that the furnaces are now filled with water. Instead of heat, we have here cold currents. And then he uses very advisedly the archaic word thrid here, meaning that the currents thread these furnaces. And I say advisedly because there is something cold about that I sound here. Then they are called rhythmic tidal lyres because in a way the great furnaces are made to be simply a pipe, as it were, for the sea. Something similar perhaps to a whistle or a pipe in a pipe organ. Here, however, it becomes the lyre. I might compare it with the so-called wind lyre or the Aeolian harp of the early 19th century, which was a device looking something like pieces of a pipe organ, miniature pipes from a pipe organ, which the wind would blow through and create interesting music. We are undoubtedly familiar with sound effects used for undersea music, in which we have high notes used, and some such sound we might imagine as coming out of the furnaces of the Titanic as the water plies through it.
I'd like to ask a question about Hardy's word choice here. Quite obvious all through the poem that there's a very rigid rhyme scheme, and in this second stanza we have pyres, fires, and lyres. Now, is Hardy stretching the point here to achieve perfect rhyme? Pyres seems, a pyre, I think, is a specific kind of fire, is it not? Talking about
Yes.
funeral pyre.
We might wonder if he's not using it advisedly here, because in a sense, the fires which burned for such a short time were the funeral pyres of the Titanic.
I think in this second stanza also we have the first of three interesting images presented, in which we find a very sharp contrast between what was planned or what was intended for the Titanic and what actually came to pass. Here in stanza 2, we see that the steel chambers, which were intended to enclose salamandrine fires, are rather ironically now being threaded by the cold currents of the ocean. And in stanza 3, I think we also have this ironical contrast between what the pride of man planned and what actually came to pass. Over the mirrors meant to glass the opulent, the sea worm crawls, grotesque, slimed, dumb, indifferent. That is, the pride of man planned these mirrors to reflect the images of wealthy women who were perhaps wearing expensive jewelry, but ironically, these very mirrors are now being used to reflect the images of the sea worms who are crawling over them.
Well, this imagery Hardy employs, again, we got a rather interesting format. Two short lines over the mirrors meant to glass the opulent. Rather strange diction there, perhaps. Mirrors meant to glass the opulent rather than to reflect. But the grotesque, slimed, dumb, indifferent, the almost brutal quality of the imagery to heighten this contrast. And yet, here is nature, dumb and indifferent, despite the fact that we have something of a hint here that this is being planned by something or some supernatural being. I wonder, note when we got to the fourth stanza, jewels enjoy design to ravish the sensuous mind. Again, two lines which describe the human intent, and then one line to describe what happened. Lie lightless, all their sparkles bleared and black and blind, bleared, black and blind, more or less playing off the slime, dumb, and indifferent of the third stanza.
Yes, I think that this is certainly one instance in which the poet very effectively makes the rhythm of his verse reinforce the meaning of the words. For you probably have noticed that in these lines that you just referred to, the opening two lines of the two previous stanzas, the first line is not in-stopped, but runs on. That is, the sense carries us over from one line to the second, which makes for a rather rapid reading. And then in the third line, we have a very dramatic caesura, in one case marked by a comma, and in the other case marked by a dash, so that one reads the first 2.5 lines fairly rapidly and then comes to a dramatic pause before this contrasting idea of the irony of what was intended and what actually came to pass is presented.
Note that all of these refer back to the vanity. The glass, the opulent, certainly a vain quality there. Jewels enjoy design to ravish the sensuous mind certainly goes back to human vanity. But he keeps, or at least so far, he has pursued this image of vanity.
Yes, and of course the Titanic is, in many respects, an ideal choice as a symbol for human vanity. Some of the most famous millionaires of this country were aboard the Titanic. I believe some of the Vanderbilts were aboard. Benjamin Guggenheim, and consequently the staterooms were lavishly appointed, and it becomes, I think, an excellent symbol of the vanity of mankind.
Of course, we mustn't forget that the people who were in steerage went down to this ship too. Well, we have the, what we might say, very vain class on board, if that is an appropriate term. We also have another segment of humanity.
But the fact that the people in the steerage went down is very interesting, because the people in steerage were not permitted to get into the lifeboats. Only the wealthiest of the travelers, of the passengers, were permitted to get into the lifeboats. In fact, a few lifeboats got off at first with only a few very wealthy people in each of them.
I wonder here, though, whether he is primarily talking about the vanity of the passengers aboard the Titanic, or whether he is mainly emphasizing simply the vanity of the whole spirit of mankind that led him to create such a ship, that led him to believe that he could create a ship which could not be sunk.
Well, I think that's his main purpose. I think in this we get a kind of tragic quality. I suppose it goes back to the Greeks, the man who suffers from an overdose of pride, the gods lay him by the heels.
Yes,
it seems, however, that both may be intended here. It is very hard to extricate the one concern with vanity from the other, the general concern with vanity from the pride of these people who are here. An excellent article to read on the subject of the sinking of the Titanic is the Hanson Baldwin essay entitled RMS Titanic. And here, emphasized is the great pride of the people who are on the boat, and also the great pride of the crew that is sailing it. So that while people cut through and tell them over the wireless that there are icebergs out here in the ocean, they're quite impatient about these notices, because after all, this ship is unsinkable. And this pride on the part of the crew and the passengers, and this pride that was even carried into, as I mentioned before, the manning of the lifeboats and the putting off of the lifeboats, when really 1,700 people were lost in this sinking, simply because of lack of lifeboats, makes it quite important that we see that it is not only a general problem of pride, but also a problem of pride specifically applied to the circumstances surrounding the sinking of the ship.
Well, this matter of vanity is certainly pursued again in stanza 5. The dim, moon-eyed fishes near gaze at the gilded gear and query, what does this vaingloriousness down here?
This is an interesting technique. Before, in the first 4 stanzas, it is the poet who has commented on the vanity. Here, however, it is the dim, moon-eyed fishes who speak. And they speak this line that is, to me, one of the most unfelicitous lines of poetry in the English language. What does this vaingloriousness down here? They say it in much the way that we would expect dim, moon-eyed fishes to say it, with mouth-filling, owlish phrases, not very pretty, but nevertheless quite cogently expressing their surprise at seeing the ship here.
Well, one critic has pointed out that the speech of the dim, moon-eyed fishes sounds like a voice crying out from Ecclesiastes, that it is a voice of doom that rather ironically has the general tone of a prophetic utterance, so that it is rather ironically here, of course, it's put into the mouth of dim, moon-eyed fishes, an interesting an unusual use of the pathetic fallacy here.
It is, of course, important for anyone who reads anything about vanity or is interested in any story concerned with vanity to read the entire book of Ecclesiastes. It's very short, only about 4 or 5 pages in most translations of the Bible, but its principal line, vanity, all is vanity, saith the preacher, has been quoted certainly for the past 3,000 years anyway.
The line has a rather pious quality about it, rather stuffy. I don't want to be irreverent, but, well, it's sort of an I told you so quality to it, I suppose.
Of course, the sentiment that is being put into the mouth of the fishes is, I think, intended to be interpreted as in this way. That is, the fishes swim around and look at the place as if to say, what does this vaingloriousness down here, which is the question you'll notice that Hardy proceeds to answer in the last half of the poem. Up until this point, he's been presenting the general problem of the conflict of what was intended and what came to pass. And after the question posed by the dim moon-eyed fishes, he attempts to answer this question and to explain how it came to pass that this luxury liner is couched at the bottom of the ocean. And you'll notice that in stanza 6, he begins in an almost conversational fashion. Well, while was fashioning this creature of cleaving wing, the immanent will that stirs and urges everything prepared a sinister mate for her.
It's interesting to notice in this line, too, Hardy's tendency to shift his word order and at times to leave words out, even in a scrambled word order, so that his while was fashioning actually means here while this creature of cleaving wing was being fashioned. It is a strange verb form, this while was fashioning, but I think we can work it out by understanding it as being a rather scrambled word order.
Well, I would like to say one thing on this, that the poem follows a very rigid form, and I'm afraid that Hardy may have strained his vocabulary or strained something in an effort to get everything in perfect form. And it seems to me that at some points he is writing in some sort of pattern that he conceived a heroic poet might have written.
Well, certainly the second line of stanza 6 presents an image that I have never been able to work out in a completely satisfactory fashion. The creature of cleaving wing apparently is the ship itself. And the ship, then, is being compared to a bird, I suppose, a bird with a cleaving wing. Now, exactly what corresponds on the ship to the wing of the bird is not perfectly clear.
The image that I like to see here is that of a ship's prow cutting the water, so that the water before the prow cleaves in rather a wing shape, or the prow of the ship is being compared with a wing that cleaves the air, much as a bird's wing would cleave the air.
Well, of course, I think that the image doesn't hold up very well, though, when we begin to examine it in its details. The prow of a ship is compared to the wing of a bird, and yet the wing is something that sticks out to one side at right angles to the direction of flight. We use the term wing, of course, in a metaphorical sense, such as the wing of a building. It's always something that goes off to the side. And to call the prow of the ship, which is at the front of the ship, a wing, seems to me to violate a principle of consistency in figurative language.
Well, I still think that Hardy was striving for elegance of diction, and he perhaps had to use the metaphors that fit with the very rigid format of the poem. I don't think it's a particularly effective metaphor, except we do get a picture of the ship flying through the water. It's that type of metaphor.
It is very common, however, to name ships after seabirds and to talk of ships as if they were seabirds flying. I'm not saying that it is a useful and accurate body of imagery, but it is nevertheless something that is very frequently recurred to.
I'm afraid that the one thing we may do with this poem, and with many others, is to become unduly picky over some of the metaphors. And I wonder what we're going to do with the immanent will that stirs and urges everything.
Well, of course, I think in the simplest terms, the immanent will becomes God as long as we clearly understand that Hardy's God is not the conventional Christian God, nor is it even an anthropomorphic God of any sort. He avoids using the term God because I think of the connotations that most of us associate with that word. Here he simply says the primary force of the universe, the first cause, whatever it is that causes things to happen in this world, was preparing at the same time a sinister mate for her.
Well, certainly we get the marriage image to which you referred earlier here, the shape of ice for the time far and dissociate. Note that a shape of ice in place of iceberg, which we are accustomed here.
Yes, we now have the interesting contrast in imagery. The ship, which has been made a creature of cleaving wing, and who is, at least toward the end of the poem, going to be compared with a bride, is now shown as about to be mated to something that can only be called a shape. It's something like the shape that Demogorgon assumes in Shelley's Prometheus Unbound. It's just a blob. It's not even a Caliban. It is something that cannot be called in any way a human shape, although it is given certain human characteristics. So he refuses to name it anything specific. It is something as shapeless as fate.
Yes, don't you think also that there is a deliberate contrast intended here between the carefully contrived construction of the ship, the very precise shape of the ship, and this shapeless mass of ice, which in its early stages, of course, was a very small mass of ice. We have a contrast not only between the gaily great ship and the sinister mate, the iceberg, but also between the carefully contrived shape of the ship and the rather shapeless mass of the ice.
I think if we want to catch Hardy on his metaphors, and this may be a rather pointless game, of course, keep in mind that an iceberg does not grow in size. It simply breaks off from an ice sheet. And if anything, it becomes smaller and smaller. So when he refers to this shadowy, silent, this thing, so the iceberg grew too, I suppose he's referring simply to the creation of the iceberg. But there's an amount of poetic license in all of this probably we needn't take too seriously.
I think, however, it can be a very important point that Hardy did not know exactly how icebergs were made.
Or if he didn't know, or if he did know, he still had to reshape things to fit the poem.
Yes, the poem would have been lost had he known or had he paid attention to it.
Well, I suppose, of course, the original mass of ice off which the iceberg breaks has to be formed somehow or another.
We can follow this for quite a distance. The 9th stanza, incidentally, one word more about the 8th stanza. You notice as the smart ship grew in stature, grace, and hue, we got the similar pairing off that we had in some of the earlier stanzas. Matter of pride and beauty, and then in the 3rd line, the contrast. The sea worms, the sparkles, vaingloriousness, and then finally the shadowy, silent distance. And then in the 9th stanza, alien they seemed to be. No mortal eye could see the intimate welding of their later history. Certainly we get this supernatural quality here again, that no mortal eye could foresee this.
Now, yes, of course, it's interesting here that Hardy implies that these two were designed from each other from their very moments of conception. This was an arranged marriage, and although one ship was being built perhaps on one side of the globe, and the iceberg was being shaped on the other side of the globe, that the two were destined for each other. Although, as you suggest, certainly no mortal eye could foresee that there would ever be any connection between the two.
Well, Hardy seems to be something of a predestinarian here, because he is saying then that even if these men had exercised their intelligence, had they had appropriate lookouts, had they paid attention to the warnings, had they had the proper drills, the ship still would have sunk.
The
And he's putting himself in an awkward position there, I think.
The implication, however, with a man of the persuasion of Hardy is that human beings just do not have foresight. They will not have foresight any more than they will have elephant hide. And so certain things are bound to come about from human activity.
Well, don't you think there's also the implication that the immanent will that stirs and urges everything is playing a sinister joke on mankind, largely in order to punish him for his overweening pride?
Well, this gets back to this element I brought in earlier, the tragic element, something that might stem from the Greeks. That in the Greek tragedy, the gods retaliate instantly and overwhelmingly, no matter how small or how great the transgression. Here it's a simple matter of pride. And this immanent will retaliates totally.
Well, the word immanent is very important here because it means indwelling. This will is part of the system. The Greek gods are thought of as being, we might say, transcendent. They are outside the system. The system works before them, and then they reach their hands in and manipulate things. This will, however, this God or power that moves the creatures of Hardy's universe, dwells within the system. We should recall here that Hardy writes during the Victorian period, and that he is afflicted by the philosophical malady that some people refer to as the Victorian dilemma. And one of the principal names in the Victorian dilemma is Charles Darwin, and the difficulties that he brought into the philosophical life of thinkers of the 19th century with his Origin of Species. We needn't say too much about the Origin of Species. All we need to say is that thanks to Darwin, the thinkers began to become concerned with the fact that the world was not being run by God from the outside, but was being run by nature from the inside, and that Therefore, things happened not because of the ethical good or the ethical bad of people who lived in the world, but things happened simply because certain laws in the universe required that they happen. And so, along this line, we see that it's quite important that they will be immanent, and that these things that happen do happen because of certain laws in the universe.
Well, that is pursued in the rest of the poem. I think we'll note that from stanza 8 on, the rest of the poem is one sentence, except for this colon. Alien they seem to be, colon, then a final unit here which is complete in itself. We got no mortal eye could foresee this welding of their history or sign that they were bent by paths coincident on being anon twin halves of one august event. And then we get this sudden conclusion. Now, I don't want to skip any of these stanzas to jump to the conclusion, but I simply wanted to point out that there is a degree of grammatical unity here, and it all depends upon this conception of this immanent will, as you describe it, Dr. Marks, something working from the inside, spinner of the ears which says, now, crash.
Yes, there are some interesting little touches of an ironical choice of words in these last three stanzas. Also, I think there's a deliberate contrast between alien and intimate. And of course, on the one level, they mean, the two words simply mean widely separated and closely joined. But intimate, on the other hand, also means friendly, I think. At least it has this connotation of friendliness.
Dr. Andrews, you mentioned earlier that we have a marriage image in this poem. I'm wondering if you feel that that image is pursued in the 10th and 11th stanzas.
Well, I think that we also have the marriage image in stanzas, certainly in stanza 11, but we also have a new set of images introduced here, or sign that they were bent by paths coincident on being anon twin halves of one august event. Coincident paths and twin halves and the two hemispheres, the note on which the poem closes, are, of course, language drawn from geometry. That is, Hardy implies that from the very beginning, the apparently aimless path of the iceberg and perhaps the carefully charted path of the Titanic were coincident. That is, they were running in the same direction, destined to collide from their very moment of conception. And I think that this geometrical set of images is employed for a very definite purpose. That is, the twin halves, the two hemispheres, and the coincident paths leave us with the impression that this tragic maritime disaster is proceeding as relentlessly as a Greek tragedy, that nothing can be done to prevent this course of events. As relentless as a Greek tragedy, or perhaps more appropriately, this series of events is taking place as inevitably as a geometrical proof is taking place. And in the final stanza, of course, not only do we have the geometrical imagery employed, the consummation comes in jars two hemispheres. The two hemispheres, I think, refer to the twin halves of the august event. That is, the ship and the iceberg are called two hemispheres, twin halves. But the same term also suggests the two hemispheres of this earth. That is, this was a collision that was metaphorically at least heard around the world. Also, we have the marriage imagery coming in again in the last line of this poem. And each one hears, and consummation comes and jars two hemispheres. Not only is this event the consummation of the series of events leading up to it, but I think this also suggests that this is the consummation of the marriage between the iceberg and the Titanic, a marriage which was destined from the very moment that the two creatures began to be formed.